Hey, and welcome to the second short lecture about nonverbal communication from Chapter 7 in your textbook. So, I want to start this short lecture by talking a little bit about nonverbal communication in mediated messages. Now, you remember that your book categorizes non-mediated messages as electronic communication, right? But all messages are mediated in some way or another. So you can think about them from this perspective, at least, in terms of emails, instant messages, texts, and so on. So one of the earliest forms that we found of nonverbal comm and mediated messages came in the form of the emoticon, right? So the emoticon was something that people figured out, right, using the keys on their keyboards to express different kinds of expressions using symbols that looked like sideways faces, right? So we have the smiley face, the winky face, the frowny face, the I'm not really sure what the hell's going on face, right? We have all these different expressions, but the reason that we use these kinds of emoticons and the reason that we use them more in the past, we don't use them as often now that we have emojis. But the reason that people started using these was because of the lean nature of mediated communication. You'll remember that a lean message is a message that lacks all the, or traditionally lacks all the nonverbal signals that come with face-to-face messages, right? So when we talk to each other face-to-face, again, we get those facial expressions, that body language, all the gestures, all the things that help augment the word, right, and help provide extra meaning. And so by using emoticons, we were able then to make these lean messages a little bit richer. Now, more recently, of course, we've begun using emojis. And we all know that people love to use these, and we're all familiar with these different faces. But it's important to recognize, right, that this kind of mediated messaging, right, this kind of nonverbal mediated messaging, although it really helps to augment the written word, they're kind of ambiguous by themselves, right? Meaning that they work best when you use them in combination with the written word. So, for example, if I just sent you a text as your teacher, right, that had this face in it, right, you'd look at it and you'd be like, what the hell does he mean, right? He's mad? Why is he mad, right? It doesn't make any sense. It could be interpreted in a bunch of ways. It's not clear what's going on. And so these kinds of symbols are really useful to make mediated messages more rich, right? To help counteract the leanness of mediated messages. But they don't do that well by themselves because emoticons and emojis are ambiguous. They can have a whole bunch of different meanings, right? Now, of course, language itself has a whole bunch of, the written language itself has all kinds of what we call paralinguistic markers that also help to add extra sort of nonverbal or outside the boundaries of language, right? These aids or these things that help give texture and emotion to our messages are outside of language, which is why we call them paralinguistic, right? Para meaning outside, linguistic meaning language, right? So they're outside of language. And so you could think of things like exclamation marks, for example. That lets us know that the message has an alacrity to it, that someone's exclaiming, right? That they're shouting or that they're really surprised or any number of things, right? I mean, the exclamation point or the exclamation mark itself is kind of ambiguous, but when used in a sentence, really helps augment that sentence and make its message richer. Ellipses, another example of this kind of paralinguistic marker. And ellipses, those three dots that you see on your phone when people are typing back to you, those are known as ellipses. And ellipses, ellipses are just gaps, right? That's what ellipses means. That's what the word means, gaps in a conversation. So what's happening when the person is typing back is there's a gap in the conversation. And that's why you see the three dots, right? There's a pause or a gap in there. And so all these kinds of paralinguistic markers, again, are best understood in context. They're best understood when you see them being used in a message, in a sentence, right? Now we have other kinds of nonverbal communication that's worth noting simply because it helps to serve a variety of functions. So your book lists all these, right? These are nonverbal behaviors that usually work in concert or at the same time with verbal communication. So there are things like repeating. Repeating is when you use body language gestures to reinforce a message. When, for example, when you're giving directions. So when you're pointing, go that way, and you point down the street, what you're doing there non-verbally is known as repeating. Complimenting is where you use nonverbal cues and body language and gestures to reinforce what you're saying. So, for example, if you're making a really important point and you point in the air, right, as you're making that point, that would be an example of complimenting. Sometimes we do what's known as substituting. So an example of this would be shrugging. It's when you use nonverbal communication as a substitute for words. Do you want to go there? No. You shake your head and you don't say anything. You just shake your head. That's substituting. Accenting. An example of that would be pointing your finger at someone when you say it's your fault, right? And by the way, that kind of accenting is also a form of repeating, right? So that's, these aren't entirely discrete kinds of terms. Then we have regulating. So an example of regulating would be nodding to help keep a conversation going, right? So regulating is a way of keeping the conversation in motion or sort of trying to control your communication with another person. And then, of course, sometimes we engage in what's known as contradicting. And that's when verbal and nonverbal communication do not agree. So, for example, one sign of dishonesty is contradicting. So, for example, someone might say yes while shaking their head no. This is a form of contradicting. It's when your verbal and nonverbal actions don't agree, or communication doesn't agree. And it's important to note that we tend to believe nonverbal forms of communication over verbal. And of course, an example of this that we've all seen is, the angry person who tells us that they're not angry, even though it's obvious that they are, right? I mean, we've all been through this with, boyfriends, girlfriends, wives, husbands, parents, right? I know you're mad. No, I'm not, right? And they got that angry look on their face. What's happening there is known as contradicting, and you know from their body language, from their nonverbal cues, that they are, in fact, upset. So speaking of nonverbal deception clues, I'll give you a few more in case you want to do some lie detecting later, right? So first, it's important to recognize that inadvertent signs of deception are called leakage. So when someone does one of these nonverbal behaviors, it indicates, right, it gives away the fact that they're lying. This is what's known as leaking. It's like you're leaking the truth, right? And there are a bunch of forms of leakage, some of which can be controlled, some of which are voluntary, and some of which are involuntary. So, for example, we know that pupil dilation occurs when people are dishonest. We know that people tend to commit more speech errors. They make their speech more abbreviated. So they speak in short sentences, and they don't really give lengthy replies, right? And also, people who are being dishonest tend to speak more slowly, right? Now, these are just markers of deception. This doesn't mean if someone looks at you and screws up what they're trying to say and they do it while speaking slowly, that doesn't mean that they're being dishonest to you. But when this happens, it is a marker of dishonesty. And when a lot of these come together, right, if you see a lot of these markers all occur at once, then that is a pretty good sign that maybe someone is trying to deceive you. So, Deception 101, right? Some findings from 50 years of study. What we found is that most people aren't good at judging whether or not they're being lied to. We like to think that we're good at detecting lies, but the truth is that the average person only is able to tell accurately if someone is lying to them or not about 54% of the time, right? 54% of the time. You might as well flip a coin, to be honest. So we all tend to overestimate our ability to tell when someone is lying to us, right? Indeed, we tend to view people as being truthful more often than they really are, right? Generally, we're pretty lenient with people, I guess we could say, right? We're pretty forgiving. We tend to think that most people are honest and most people are telling us the truth. But that isn't necessarily the case, right? And a lot of the signs that we think are signs of deception aren't. So you probably heard things like, well, when I first met my wife, right, her thing was, well, if you look up and to the left when you say something, that means you're lying. That's not true, right? We know, in fact, that liars often sustain more eye contact than truthful people, right? So it's not someone can't meet your gaze, so they must be lying. That's not true, right? Generally speaking, that's simply not true. Also, we think that the person who's fidgeting a lot in their chair is lying. That's not true either, right? Indeed, good liars or liars in general fidget less than people who tell the truth. So there is an entire science behind this, and this is something that people in communication study, right? And these are some of the things we found out over time. So going back to a general, sort of the general point of much of this, right? We need to recognize that nonverbal communication is ambiguous. So it has many potential interpretations, and honestly, it's difficult, if not impossible, to know which one is correct. One example of this that your book gives that I think is kind of funny, right, happened with the Safeway grocery stores. So Safeway instituted a program some years ago now called the Superior Service Program. And the idea was that all their clerks, all their salespeople, everyone on the floor, the stock people, everybody, when they saw a customer, they were supposed to smile at that customer while making eye contact, right? So the whole idea was that this would be helpful in two ways, actually, right? So the reasoning was that this would, number one, cut back on theft, right? Because people who shoplift don't like to be acknowledged, right? And many studies have shown that making eye contact or simply acknowledging someone when they walk into a business will cut down on shoplifting. If you say hi to someone when they walk into your store, they're less likely to steal things. So that's number one. But number two, the idea was that people would feel valued and engaged and feel like that the people who work there were taking an interest in them. The problem was that shortly after they started this, they got all kinds of complaints from customers about the people who work there making sexual advances towards them. So these employees, these poor employees who were told, listen, just smile and make eye contact with everybody who comes in, they were doing it, but the reaction of many people was, why are they hitting on me? Why are they coming on to me? Right? So they thought that it was like a sexual come-on thing, right? Instead of them just trying to be friendly. So this shows that nonverbal behavior, again, is really ambiguous. It's really hard to figure out sometimes. And people are very willing to engage in attribution bias. And instead of saying, oh, they just want to be friendly and help me, it's like, oh, well, they're trying to get into my pants, right? So, again, nonverbal communication is ambiguous. We also find, interestingly, that there are people with a recognized medical condition known as NVLD, or nonverbal learning disorder. Now, this people with nonverbal learning disorder have a processing deficit on the right half of their brain that makes it difficult for them to interpret things like facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, and this, by the way, is particularly evident in children. Interestingly enough, people who have NVLD also have a lot of trouble with mathematics and spatial relations. So if you have a lot of trouble in math class and you keep backing your car into the back of your garage and you have trouble telling what people mean when they talk to you, you might have NVLD. So here's a short video on about a young woman who suffers from NVLD. I'll let you watch that on your own since I'm trying to keep this lecture short. All right, so that wraps it, and thank you for checking this out. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.